The morning it all began. The town of Dry Mesa woke under a red desert sunrise, the kind that burned the sky like a warning, and the air tasted like dust, gunpowder, and the fear people carried silently in their throats. Folks had been on edge for weeks. Cattle were disappearing, stagecoaches were robbed along the canyon trails, and the outlaws known only as the Slate Ridge Gang had grown bold enough to fire guns at the sheriff's office at night, just to remind everybody who really ran the land. The townspeople didn't talk much about it in public, but behind closed doors the mothers worried, the merchants hid their silver, and the men began sleeping with rifles leaning by their doors. Still, nobody expected help, nobody expected rescue, and nobody expected him. It happened on a dry, windless morning when Sheriff Holt, a stubborn man who carried more responsibilities than bullets, found footprints circling the jailhouse. They weren't outlaw prints. They were bare, silent, purposeful, like someone had walked across the sand without intending to leave a trace. Holt followed them around the corner, hand on his revolver, only to see a tall, broad-shouldered Apache man standing under the shade of the water tower. His hair was braided down his back, his chest wrapped in old ceremonial leather, and his eyes were as still as the canyon boulders. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't speak, just watched. Holt tried speaking to him, but the man didn't respond. Not to English, not to Spanish, not even to the sheriff's attempt at a few Apache phrases he had learned years back. The stranger didn't lift a hand, didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He simply existed there, as though he belonged to the land itself. The townspeople gathered slowly, whispering in nervous circles, unsure whether he was a warning or a blessing. Some feared he was a scout for an Apache raid. Others believed he might be running from something himself. But old Mrs. Delaney, who ran the bakery and believed she could read souls by looking in people's eyes, stepped forward and whispered, "That man ain't here to hurt us." Something brought him. Even Holt couldn't deny it. There was something in the stranger's presence that calmed the dust, something solid, ancient, immovable. They would learn his name later, not from his lips, because he never spoke a single word, but from the stories whispered about him by neighboring tribes. His name was Coda, meaning the quiet one, or he who walks with storms. But for now, all the town knew was that he stood there, silent, like a sentinel placed by fate. First sign he wasn't just passing through came when the Slate Ridge Gang rode in at noon, guns raised, dust swirling behind their horses like angry spirits. Their leader, Clay Sutter, a man whose eyes burned with cruelty, stepped off his horse and fired a warning shot at the sky. "Dry Mesa!" he shouted. "We're collecting our due!" Folks ran inside. Doors slammed. Curtains snapped shut. Sheriff Holt stood alone on the main street until he realized he wasn't alone. The Silent Apache was standing 10 feet behind him, calm as still water, hands at his sides, no weapon visible. Clay Sutter noticed him and snarled, "What's this? You hired yourself an Apache guard dog?" Holt felt the tension in the air like a tightening noose. Coda didn't react, didn't move, didn't breathe any differently. He simply looked at the outlaw leader with an expression so steady, so unmoved, that Clay's confidence cracked for half a heartbeat. "I don't know who he is," Holt said honestly, "but he's not your problem. I am." Clay laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Sheriff, you ain't been nobody's problem in years." His men aimed their rifles. Women peeked from windows. And for the first time, Holt realized the Silent Apache had stepped forward so subtly that even he hadn't noticed. Coda now stood between the sheriff and the gang, his posture straight, eyes locked on Clay. No threat, no violence, just a presence. Clay lifted his gun toward him. "Move aside, Apache." Coda didn't blink. Clay fired. The shot cracked through the still air, but before it reached him, Coda moved. He didn't dodge, didn't dive. It was smoother than that. He simply shifted his weight a hair to the right, and the bullet grazed past, embedding itself into the wooden post behind him. The gang froze. The town gasped. Something in the silence that followed felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Clay's eyes widened, not with fear but with insult. "So you want to play hero?" he growled. "Fine." He fired again, this time aiming to kill. But Coda was already moving. Not with speed, but with a strange, calm certainty, like he knew where each bullet would fly before it even left the barrel. He picked up a fallen horseshoe from the dirt and threw it with a flick of his wrist, smooth, controlled, effortless. It spun like a silver blade and struck Clay's gun hand, sending the pistol clattering across the ground. The outlaws panicked, firing wildly, shouting, trying to figure out whether they were fighting a man or a ghost. Coda didn't waste emotion. He moved with the desert wind, silent, efficient, disarming 3 gunmen before the 4th realized what was happening. Pulling one outlaw off a horse with a single sweep of his arm, and knocking another flat with a palm strike so controlled it seemed almost gentle. And then it was over. 4 outlaws on the ground, Clay on his knees, bleeding from the knuckles, staring up at the silent figure towering above him like a judgment carved from stone. Coda didn't kill him, didn't strike him again. He simply stared into Clay's soul, long enough to make the outlaw look away, ashamed, furious, humiliated. When Holt finally arrested them and dragged the gang to the jail, the whole town erupted in whispers. Who was he? Why had he helped them? Why didn't he speak? Coda stayed in Dry Mesa, not because anyone asked, not because anyone paid him, but because something in his eyes said he wasn't done. He slept outside under the stars, declining offers for shelter with a faint shake of his head. He helped repair fences that had been broken for years. He carried water for elderly townsfolk. He stood guard at night without being asked. And he never, not once, said a single word. Children followed him like he was some sort of guardian spirit. Women brought him food, thanking him shyly. Men nodded respectfully when passing by. Yet no one understood the depth of silence he carried, the wounds beneath it. But they would. They all would. Because when the Slate Ridge gang returned, this time with dozens of riders hell-bent on revenge, Dry Mesa would fall unless the Silent Apache stepped forward again. And what he would do next would become a legend that spread across the frontier for generations. And before this chapter closes, narrator directly to your viewers, if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps these powerful frontier legends continue. The night the Slate Ridge gang returned, the wind died so suddenly that even the tumbleweeds stopped rolling. Darkness pressed heavy over Dry Mesa, suffocating in a way that felt unnatural, as though the desert itself had paused to listen. Sheriff Holt couldn't sleep. Neither could anyone else. Word had reached them that Clay Sutter's brother, Malcolm Sutter, was gathering every outlaw from the surrounding territories to storm the town and burn it to the ground. Malcolm was mean, smarter, and far more ruthless than Clay. And unlike Clay, he didn't make threats, he made examples. Holt looked out across the empty main street, lantern in hand, wondering how many lives would be lost by sunrise. Then he saw the silhouette, again. The lone, tall figure sitting absolutely still atop the water tower. Coda, the Silent Apache. Holt climbed up to speak to him, even though he knew he wouldn't get a reply. "They're coming," Holt said quietly. 100 men, maybe more. Coda didn't nod, didn't turn, didn't blink. But Holt continued, speaking more to himself than anything. "I don't know why you helped us, and I don't know what you owe this town. But we're outmatched, and when they come, people will die." Still, the Apache did not reply. Holt finally descended, leaving the man to his silence. At dawn, the outlaws came, 40 riders at first, then 50, then more. A river of horses poured over the ridge like a swarm of locusts. Malcolm Sutter rode at the front, tall, furious, armed to the teeth. His voice boomed across the sand, "Dry Mesa. Hand over the Apache who attacked my brother, or we burn your homes and bury your dead." The townspeople stood trembling behind the sheriff's office barricade. Women clutched their children. Men gripped their rifles with shaking hands. Some whispered prayers. Others simply cried. Holt stepped forward, heart pounding, knowing he couldn't give up Coda even if he wanted to. The man had saved them, and betrayal wouldn't sit right on a town's soul. Malcolm sneered. "No answer? Fine. Then you die screaming." He raised his arm to signal the attack, and an arrow struck the ground between his horse's hooves. Silence, stillness, confusion rippled across the outlaws, because from atop the highest rooftop, standing tall against the rising sun, was Coda, alone, bare-chested, braids whipping in the wind, bow in one hand, spear strapped across his back. Eyes focused with a calmness so absolute it made even the desert feel small beneath him. Malcolm snarled, "You think you can fight 50 men alone?" Coda didn't answer. He simply drew another arrow, and the war began. Malcolm roared a command, and the outlaws charged like a stampede of fury. But Koda moved with the precision of a man who had walked through fire before and learned to dance with it. His first arrow struck a rider's rifle, splitting the stock in two. His second dropped another man's hat clean off his head, missing flesh on purpose, a warning, a test. But they didn't listen. And so Koda changed. His body became a blur, a ghost moving faster than fear. He leapt from roof to roof with inhuman balance. Arrows flew like whispers, horses reared, men panicked. His spear found hands, weapons, reins, never hearts, never throats. He disarmed without killing, dismantling the mob with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. But the outlaws kept coming. More climbed the ledges, more circled from behind. Gunshots cracked through the air, bullets cutting splinters from the wooden beams beneath his feet. One grazed his arm, leaving a streak of blood that only made him calmer, colder, more focused. He dropped from the roof into the alley, landing in silence, rolling to absorb the impact. 3 outlaws sprinted toward him with knives. Koda vaulted off the wall, twisted midair, and struck each man in a single sweeping motion, palm, elbow, heel, dropping them like falling wheat. Holt and the townsfolk could only watch in awe, too stunned to lift their rifles. But Malcolm Sutter was no fool. He realized this was not a fight he could win by numbers, so he aimed for the town instead. "Burn IT!" he screamed, grabbing a torch and lighting it with a flare. "Let the Apache watch your homes fall!" He hurled the flaming torch toward the general store, but before it landed, Koda was already there. He slid across the dirt, catching it with one bare hand, extinguishing it in the sand. Malcolm snarled, furious, and fired at him repeatedly. Koda ducked behind a wagon, rolled underneath it, and emerged on the other side so silently it seemed impossible. With one fluid motion, he shattered Malcolm's rifle with the blunt end of his spear. Malcolm responded with a knife swing, wide, wild, sloppy. Koda sidestepped, caught Malcolm's wrist, twisted gently until the knife dropped, and pushed him backward into the dust. Malcolm scrambled, humiliated, furious, and drew a second gun from his boot. "Die!" he roared, firing at point-blank range. But Koda didn't fall, didn't bleed, didn't even flinch, because Sheriff Holt had stepped between them, taking the bullet to the shoulder. Holt collapsed, gasping. Malcolm smirked. "Should have minded your business, Sheriff." And he raised his gun again. This time, Koda did strike to end it, not with blood, but with truth. He grabbed Malcolm's arm before the outlaw could blink, pulled him forward, and slammed him into the ground, with a force that cracked the earth beneath him. Malcolm lay stunned, breath gone, fight gone, spirit broken. When he looked back at the Apache towering above him, he finally understood. This man wasn't fighting to protect Dry Mesa for glory, or pride, or revenge. He was fighting because the town had become something to him, something sacred, something worth defending. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader defeated, fled in panic, disappearing across the desert like cowards chased by ghosts. The townspeople rushed to Holt, bandaging his wound, comforting him. But their eyes were drawn to Koda, who stood quietly at the edge of town, watching the horizon as though listening to something no one else could hear. He did not celebrate, did not boast, did not stay. Instead, as the sun climbed higher and the people of Dry Mesa gathered to thank him, he simply nodded once, softly, respectfully, then turned and walked into the desert without leaving a single word behind. Children tried to follow, but he lifted a hand gently, telling them without speaking that this was where his path split from theirs. The town owed him everything, yet he asked nothing, not praise, not shelter, not reward. And that silence, that pure, humble silence, was what made him a legend. In the years that followed, stories of the Silent Apache spread across the frontier, of the man who saved a town without ever speaking a word, who protected people who were not his own, who fought not for vengeance but for balance. Some claimed he was a spirit, others swore they saw him in distant mountains, watching storms roll in. Dry Mesa survived, thrived, and never forgot. And as the narrator wrapping up this final chapter, here's the last line for your viewers. If you want more powerful Western legends like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive across the frontier.